From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Beres.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. And Nick Beres here, and it's good to have you with us, a live program. And I'm going to invite you to join in the conversation with us today. As you know, this weekend will be a solemn remembrance memorial. It's just hard for me to believe it's been 20 years since the September 11th attack in 2001. And certainly it affected all of us here in this country. And later in the show today, I'll be joined by Mark Binda, our programming director. We'll talk a little bit about that day because we were on this very set that morning when the news broke of what was happening. We were live on the air, and just how we handled and reacted in the newsroom, and we're in utter disbelief. And I think many of you at home certainly probably remember where you were. And this is an instance where, depending on where you lived in this country, because it happens early in the morning the way it did, most people probably were either at home, still in bed, getting up ready for work, or already at work like we were. So I invite you to join in the conversation, 737-7587, to talk about maybe your memories there. And then we're also going to be, just talking a bit with a professor here in a moment that we'll bring on about, what this anniversary is all about, what we learned from it, where we stand. And just to remind you, again, it was 19 men hijacked 4 fuel-loaded U.S. commercial airplanes, as you recall, bound for West Coast destinations. A total of 229,777 people were killed in New York City, Washington, D.C., and in Pennsylvania. We know all that, of course, the World Trade Towers. We're going to have some video we're going to show you this morning as well, back from that fateful day. We're not going to show any of the video of the planes colliding with the Twin Towers, but some of the aftermath and some as it came down, and then some of the historical moments, including when the president was notified of what happened and beyond. We'll revisit some of that, but I do invite you to join in the conversation, 737-7587. With us to talk a bit about this 20 years later is Vanderbilt professor John Weil. Good morning to you, sir. It's good to have you on, and it is amazing. It's been 20 years. So much is happening. One thing I noticed in the news just this past week is even 20 years later, they continue, as they should, to still try to identify the remains of those who died in the Twin Towers. And still, so many people have not been identified, but 2 more just recently were. And I know that must mean a lot to the families, but so much probably will never be identified just because of the scope and the damage of that incident. So just your thoughts on all of that, Professor.
There's every generation, it seems, has one or more sort of pivotal events that shape, not only our political life, but our emotional life. And I think, to my childhood, probably the most dramatic event was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Generation or so before, it was the attack on Pearl Harbor. A lot of younger viewers who, may have been in school when the Challenger exploded. And then, of course, 9/11. This last year, may go down in the history books, fairly unusual election, COVID, the attack on the Capitol. But these are, that they have as much of an emotional effect probably as anything that we collectively share in common.
And when we do think back, it's been 20 years, and when that occurred, how much has really changed since then? It's just stunning. Much of what we take, as ordinary now was such a change at the time. I mean, think about with regard to security after that, how we travel, where we go, the type of security upgrades that have occurred in Washington, D.C., and frankly, in every major city across the country with regard to the concern over terrorist attacks. It just, in some ways, has changed so much.
We had something similar a decade or 2 before, maybe 3 decades before, when there was a spate of airline hijackings. And, I can still remember the time where, you didn't worry too much about getting on a plane, and now you go through all kinds of security. I guess one of the amazing things about 9/11 is that we haven't had a major attack within the United States since then. And, maybe what we're finding out is that the primary dangers we face today may not be the foreign foe. You know, it may not be the person dressed in a turban or speaking a different language or professing a different religion. It may be people around us. You know, I guess the nearest we've had to 9/11 was the Oklahoma City bombings, and that turned out to be a domestic terrorist. This last year, you know, the attack on the Capitol was, as far as I can tell, domestic. You know, it may have been fed by misinformation from foreign sources, but again, it was domestically generated.
Let's take a look if we can. I think we've pulled some video from that day 20 years ago, 20 years ago this weekend. But Mary Elena, the first clip that we want to show of, I believe, you know, when it occurred. Again, we're not showing the collision of the airplanes into the World Trade Towers, but some of what came after. Let's have a look at that. Do we have that queued up? Yeah, just the B-roll if you'd like, and then you let me know if we have some with audio as well you want to take, just what order. There we go, and I still remember, oh my gosh, it still just gives me chills. We're only going to watch that once right now. I mean, that is just devastating. It just so hard to believe when it occurred, and thankfully you're correct, we haven't seen anything like that since, to that degree, obviously, but to think that those very iconic towers just vanished basically in an instant, and all these images, doesn't it just give you chills to a degree? It's interesting, Professor. I'll see movies sometimes that were shot before then, and you see the aftermath, where you see the Twin Towers, again, because they were captured in the movie as part of the skyline in Manhattan, and now they're gone, of course. And you look, it almost looked like it snowed, and that's the debris in the aftermath, which caused, of course, so many more health problems for the first responders.
Sure. You know, one thing, I don't know if the question has ever been answered, but as bad as it was, you know, the plane that went down in Pennsylvania, my assumption has always been that it probably was headed to the Capitol building or the White House or, you know, another iconic building within D.C. And, you know, the symbolism of that also would have been, you know, equally traumatizing. Probably not as many people killed, but certainly, you know, certainly would have been traumatic. Yeah, and as we recall, you know, with the situation in the crash in Pennsylvania, it was the passengers and crew on board that played a pivotal role in knowing they were going to die and still stormed the cockpit to stop it from reaching its destination. Yeah, and I think in some ways the most redeeming aspect of that day, other than the heroic response of the first responders, was, you know, what these events do is that they withhold agency. It's like we're victims. There's nothing we can do about it. And as sad as it was that people had to, you know, jeopardize their own lives to bring a plane down, it was Americans saying, you know, no, we're not going to permit this. We're going to rally together. You know, part of what we've done, of course, is we've rallied in some, probably looking back, fairly dubious international affairs that may or may not have increased our security. Yeah, it's just interesting. Again, of course, when that happened, it caught so many off guard. I think we have a clip audio of when President Bush was, as you'll recall, he was at a school talking, and initially when he was told of what happened, and you know, I remember that made a lot of news, and he immediately left to address the issue. But let's have a look at that. These are some pivotal moments.
60 on page 153. At the count of 3, everyone should be on page 153. If the yellow paper is going to bother you, drop it. Thank you. Everybody touch the title of your story. Fingers under the title. Get ready to read the
Down in front. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. I, unfortunately, will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary of Rod Pace and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at the Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence.
Wow, you know, Professor, I remember that like it was yesterday. I really remember the moment, and I wonder exactly what it was his aide whispered in his ear when he was sitting there in the classroom, just at that moment. And you can just tell, I mean, the president was processing what he was told, and then I think he learned more, obviously, and we jumped from that to when he gave the speech. But there was the first plane he was talking about, and then the second plane, and realized, because, you know, initially, wasn't it, too, that the very first report that was, we thought maybe this was a plane that had a malfunction and just a horrible accident. And we weren't sure, a devastating one, of course, but we thought it might have just been an accident. And then, of course, there was no doubt when we saw the second plane. I wonder if that's when they knew for sure this was a terrorist attack, because initially that first one we thought, wait a second, is this just a horrible accident with the plane off course?
Notice Bush said this apparent terrorist attack. I think even then we weren't positive. We were a bit naive, but you know, who would expect that somebody would sacrifice 3,000 innocent lives? You know, Bush initially, I remember there was a very prominent movie that criticized Bush for his initial reaction. You know, why didn't he get up and immediately run to the plane? And I've thought a lot about this, and I think a lot of it was his attempt, and I don't know if it worked that well or not, but it was his attempt to say, we're going to carry on no matter how bad it is. You know, we're not going to all get up running around with chickens like our heads cut off. And I think that was actually fairly effective for the moment. Now, whether we followed through on it, one could question, but, you know, it's just hard to imagine being in his position and, you know, probably wondering, you know, was there something that I could have done to prevent this? You know, should we have foreseen it?
Right. Yeah, all those questions. And we'll talk a bit about that, about, you know, how it was they were able to pull this off. And then, of course, he was correct. He had left office by that point, but we know they ultimately got the individual responsible for this 10 years later, Osama bin Laden. So listen, let's take a break and we'll come back. We can take a few phone calls if you'd like, and then we'll continue our conversation in this next segment with Vanderbilt Professor John Weil right after this. Stay with us.